All right, other side. Two things here that are rarely understood, sometimes, in fact, often disabled. So we're going to talk about those. The SU, that's basically it. You've got your choke, throttle, damper system, float bowl. I mean, it's as complicated as that. The same thing with the Strombergs. In fact, the earlier ones didn't even have this. Some of them might not have a temperature compensator, but later ones do, so we're going to talk about that anyway. This is your temperature compensator. After this air piston, that's when you're changing the mixture. The needle and its relation to the jet, that's setting the mixture up. It's keeping it at a constant regardless of how far the piston's open. So what's changing is, with the starter, you're changing the mixture after the air piston. It's happening right around here. You also have extra air coming in through here. You can kind of see the end of my pointer there, and going into the carburetor again after the air piston. So this system is intended to introduce more air to lean out the mixture a little bit. And the way that it works, it's a valve just at the very tip, right? So this valve will either plug or let in a little bit of air. It goes through these holes and out through the end, sits in there like that. And how this works is, this is a bimetal strip. So you've got two pieces of metal, but they are not the same metal. And metals, if you remember from school, expand at different rates. And so if you have two of them stuck together and one expands faster than the other, it's going to bend. That bending action is what opens the valve at a specific temperature. And there's a little bit of a tension on it already. That's what this little nut does. And in one of my other videos, I show you a method for showing how to set this. But the short version is, you want the valve to start opening, I want to say it's right around 50 degrees Celsius or 125. It should be fully open, might be 115, somewhere in that range. Google it, you can find out the specific temperatures. But you would basically set it up so that, put it in a tank of water where you know the temperature. Watch this open. If it doesn't open, loosen it a little bit, and it's basically as simple as that. But all this is doing is it's introducing a little bit more air when the ambient temperature in here warms up. Temperature compensator needs a couple of gaskets because you don't want air to get in if it's not supposed to be there. Whenever I've verified that the temperature compensator is working, I like to put a new cover on it. Just A, it looks cleaner, but B, I also won't forget which one's which. And I'll know that I've already done it. Alright, last piece is the bypass valve. Alright, so bypass valve is this guy here. And let's talk about when that's useful. When you have the choke on, it keeps the air piston, the air valve down most of the way, right? And you're changing the mixture because the air is flowing through it very quickly. And it basically end up with a very rich mixture. On deceleration, a similar thing is happening. Not exactly the same, but it's a similar thing. You've got lots of air and fuel going through. When you've got the throttle wide open, you let off the throttle suddenly. And now all of a sudden you've got a spot in your mixture where there's nothing getting through. And so it ends up, that's where you get the popping sound that comes out of the exhaust. And in a really bad scenario, you could actually potentially do damage. But anyway, what this thing is designed to do is to take care of that problem. There is a tiny hole right here. And on some carburetors, it's in here. I don't know why they choose the drilling in different places. But anyway, tiny hole right there. It goes to here. So you can see when this is going to be drawing a vacuum, the throttle is closed. If it's open, well, that hole is not really relevant. And so there's not going to be a very strong vacuum going through there. So it's when the throttle is closed, you get a strong vacuum because that's the only place that it can go to. It goes to this hole here. And that hole is going to put a vacuum through here, which is going to move the diaphragm that's inside here. It's going to open it up. When it opens it up, you can now move a fuel air mixture between here and here. Otherwise, those are closed off separately. Where's that? What's that doing? Where am I here? It's opening between 1 and 2 here. Okay? One of these goes straight into the body of the carb on the other side of this throttle plate. The other one comes out right here. So as the name implies, it is bypassing the throttle plate. So when you close the throttle very suddenly, you don't want that popping out of the exhaust. The mixture isn't right. What it's allowing it to do is it opens up a diaphragm using the vacuum on this side of the throttle, which is now closed, and it's taking that fuel air mixture, which is already mixed by your needle and air valve and everything over here, which is already mixed, and it's letting it come out here. And that's controlled by a spring that's inside the bypass valve. So let's look at how that works. Here's the pieces to it. Grab a diaphragm. Alright, bypass valve diaphragm looks like this. And you want to make sure that you're using a new one. This is not something that's included in most of the carburetor rebuild kits. And what happens is this diaphragm gets, well, old, basically. And it starts to just get very hard and brittle, and it will leak. And if it leaks, then you're bypassing all of the time, which obviously isn't good. But anyways, you want to make sure that that's nice and moving, that there's no holes in it. Generally don't reuse these. They're pretty cheap. You just have to buy them separately. And this will go, line everything up inside here. There's a spring that keeps pressure on it when it's put together. See? Now, the pressure on here, this diaphragm is going to seat against the outside. That's what, I'll use this. It's going to seat on this hole. So this is an opening. This goes into the throat of the carburetor. This is already mixed fuel and air. And then there's nothing able to come out here because the valve is closed. This is just a valve. And what controls how much, I guess, negative pressure, because you're using a vacuum, what controls how much of that is getting through is this piece in here. Now, this one is sealed off. You see there's a brass plug here. And if you actually wanted to adjust this, you need to pull it out. And that's all it is. It's just, you adjust it by screwing this in and out, and that's going to give you kind of a preload on the spring. Why would you want to adjust it? Well, if it's not working at all, for example, or if you have, sometimes you can end up in a situation where you can't, whatever you do, get the idle below, let's call it 2,500 RPM. Doesn't matter how much you unscrew, how much you close the throttle, you just can't get the idle down very far. There's a good chance it's because of this. Because if there's a hole in that diaphragm, remember what's happening, regardless of the throttle being opened or closed, you're letting air and fuel from one side to the other, and it's coming straight into the engine anyway, right into the manifold. So if the diaphragm and the bypass valve is broken, if it's got a hole in it, you're going to end up with that. The same thing can happen if it's not adjusted correctly. Screw here, it's a good thing I've got spares. And just like the other screws on here, these are not Phillips head, this is Posi-Drive. Make sure you're using the correct driver, you're going to strip out the screw heads. Alright, now, side note before I put this one back on, this is an older style. Some of them you've got a tube coming out the top, that will go to the manifold. Sometimes will have some tubes coming off of it for vacuum, and you'll plug that onto the top of here in some cars. But anyway, on this one, you can see right here, there's a screw head. There's not a brass plug in it. And that's because this bypass valve is adjustable. Now technically, they're all like that. If I took this back apart, you're going to see a flathead screw right there. And what that's doing is, you can put a screwdriver in, and you can adjust the tension that would go on the spring. This is the same piece in here, but you'll be able to adjust the tension that goes on the spring. So on the other one, you have to pull it out, manually twist it, put it back in. On this one, you can just adjust it on the fly. Kind of a cool concept. If you're really careful, you should actually be able to just drill that out, get rid of the brass plug. Just make sure that there's a new O-ring and that it seals well, otherwise it's going to leak air. Ask me how I know. Anyway, that's enough of that. This needs a gasket also. Make sure the holes line up on your gasket. Okay, there we go. A couple more pieces and we're done. This is the idle trim screw. And as a general rule, if you're rebuilding the carburetor, unless you've got a exhaust gas analyzer, you are not going to actually get any benefit out of this at all. What this does is it uses the same air passageway that the temperature compensator does, and lets in a little bit more or a little bit less air, but it's extremely minute amounts. And again, if you don't have a temperature compensator, if you don't have an exhaust gas analyzer, it's really kind of useless to try and adjust it because you're really not going to notice much of a difference, if any at all. And so what I typically will do with these is put them in kind of a neutral setting, screw it in all the way, let it out a turn, leave it alone, and you're good to go there. If you have an exhaust gas analyzer, by all means feel free to trim your air mixture with that, but otherwise you don't really have to deal with it. And that, I believe, is it. We have a Zenith Stromberg carburetor that has been rebuilt. Oh, of course we need this bit up here. This is where the choke cable attaches. We'll get a clip for that. These stupid things are always broken or missing. There. Oh, almost. Gonna snap it on. There. That's what's going to hold your choke cable in, which will of course attach to there. And we're good to go. So we've got the choke is operating correctly. You can see it's opening and closing the throttle a little bit. This is your idle speed adjuster. The choke, for obvious reasons, needs to be off when you adjust it, otherwise you're throwing that off anyway. Over here we've got the temperature compensator. This, when the ambient temperature gets a little bit warmer, it's going to open up and let a slight amount more air in, not very much. Effectively it's an emissions component, but there's no reason not to have it. It's not hurting performance. Your idle trim screw, which again really does nothing unless you've got an exhaust gas analyzer. The bypass valve, which is going to, when you let off the throttle on deceleration, it's going to prevent that popping and backfiring, save you a little bit there. And the throttle, obviously, opens and shuts. And then the rest of it, the magic, is in this air valve system, which basically makes this infinitely self-adjusting. If you have a call for more fuel and air, the piston's going to go up and it's going to let that in. It's going to keep the mixture constant regardless of how fast the air is moving. And the only time that's going to change is if you do it on purpose. So for example, if you're opening up the choke, it doesn't matter where this system is, it's going to let in a little bit more fuel because it's bypassing that system. So really cool carburetor. I guess the one other thing that I don't see on this, they did do the drilling. So this carburetor is going to need a fitting on top. I'm going to grab one of those. And this has to do with the distributor vacuum. So the way that it works, your distributor, which by the way 99% of carburetor problems are actually distributor problems, but I digress. The way that this works is that your distributor is going to change your advance, and it's based on vacuum. So we're going to do another video on that, but trust me on it, the distributor is going to depend on vacuum, and it's either going to advance or retard based on how much you're getting and when you're getting it. So you might just be able to see it, maybe not. Let's try zooming in. Right there, you can maybe just barely see it. I'm going to try and get the pointer on it here. Right there, it looks like basically a dirty spot on it. That is a drilling. And if you look right around there, you'll see the drilling is going through here inside the carburetor. Now, notably, that hole is on the other side of the throttle plate, not on the manifold side. And so that's for a vacuum advance, because what you're going to want is you're only getting a vacuum when the throttle is open, right? Before then, there's really not much vacuum. The throttle's sealing it off. Throttle opens, vacuum comes through that hole. When you get vacuum, this is going to go to the distributor advance capsule, and it's going to advance the timing. Sometimes you'll see a hole on the bottom. That's going to be for the vacuum retard, generally, not always. It's going to be like this one. This is for a vacuum retard, because this one has a hole that is open when the throttle is closed. You can't see it well on the camera, but trust me, it's there. And so when the throttle is closed, the only place the manifold has to draw from is going to be, well, from this tube that's on the bottom of the carb. And so that's going to go to the vacuum retard. when the throttle is closed, high manifold vacuum, it slows down the idle by retarding the timing a little bit. And then you open it up, it's not relevant anymore, speeds up the timing, you can have a very nice idle, and you get some acceleration when you do open the throttle. That's exactly what you want. So vacuum retard isn't always bad, it's just a different system. And just remember that less retard is the same as more advanced. So carburetors are where they get that signal that goes to the distributor, which we're going to cover more in another video. But if you guys have questions on these, again, very simple in terms of operation, very simple in terms of even rebuilding them. They're not that complicated. I'd say the most complex things are going to be probably with the SUs, because you need to center that needle. You want to make sure that when you lift the air piston, that it drops back down. You can probably hear that click. If you're not getting that click when it drops back down, that means that the needle is not centered in the jet. And so you need to make sure that you have that when you're rebuilding these. Just a side note addendum. Some versions of Zenith Stromberg carburetors do not have the bypass valve. But you see there's kind of like a little dimple here and here on the throttle plate. Some of these, especially the early ones I think, had a little valve, 2 of them actually, with a little spring behind it, and that spring was tuned so that exactly the same thing, you close the throttle and those opened temporarily just to let some additional flow through, but only under very high vacuum. Generally it would come into effect on deceleration to accomplish the same thing. So there you have it, just a quick side note for you. That's basically it. If you guys have questions, post them in the comments below. Like, subscribe, all that jazz. Thanks for watching.